Silas, his 77th winter creeping slowly across the high Austrian Alps, moved with the deliberate economical grace of a man who had long ago ceased to waste motion. His cabin, a stoic sentinel against the biting wind, had been his world for decades. A solitary realm where the only dialogues were between the creaking timbers and the howling gales. His face, a roadmap of sun-scorched summers and frost-nipped winters, bore the indelible marks of a life lived on the fringes, far from the softened edges of civilization. Each morning, before the sun dared to kiss the snow-capped peaks, he was already awake, the scent of pine smoke and brewing coffee a familiar comfort in the biting chill. His days unfolded in a predictable, almost ritualistic rhythm, checking the long line of traps he maintained, a duty passed down through generations, mending the worn leather of his snowshoes, sharpening the keen edge of his axe. The work was hard, unyielding, a constant battle against the elements that left little room for introspection. Yet the unspoken weariness that clung to him was a burden far heavier than any physical toil. It was the weight of years spent alone, the silent echoes of decisions made long ago, decisions that had driven away a family he rarely allowed himself to remember, a daughter whose face had blurred with the passing seasons. He carried a particular kind of quiet regret, a shadow that stretched long in the short winter days, and often, in the deepest hours of night, it would creep into the corners of his dreams, a silent, accusatory whisper. One particularly brutal patrol, as a blizzard, born from the churning clouds high above, began to gather its furious strength. Threatening to swallow the entire landscape in a whiteout, Silas pushed deeper into a ravine he rarely traversed. The snow, already knee-deep, clung to his wool trousers, and the wind, a sharp-toothed predator, tore at his hooded cloak. He had almost turned back, the wise part of his mind urging retreat, when a glint of dark rock, half concealed by a recent minor rockfall, caught his eye. It was a small, almost imperceptible grotto, a dark mouth in the otherwise unbroken expanse of white. Curiosity, an old dangerous companion, tugged at him. Inside, the air was still, surprisingly sheltered, yet thick with the metallic tang of blood and the pungent scent of fear. His breath caught, a cold knot tightening in his chest. There, nestled amongst shattered shale and icy rock, lay a she-wolf, Lyra, her powerful body a pathetic heap of matted, grey-brown fur. Her left hind leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, clearly broken, and a dark, sticky stain bloomed across her flank. She was terribly emaciated, her ribs stark beneath her skin, but her eyes, a burning, defiant amber, were fixed on him, a desperate creature on the brink of oblivion, yet still ready to fight. Huddled against her, barely clinging to life, were two tiny pups, Finn and Anya, small trembling bundles of fur, their eyes still blue, their tiny whimpers almost swallowed by the rising wind outside. Their mother, Lyra, didn't growl, didn't snarl. She simply watched, a raw, primal intensity in her gaze that spoke of an unwavering, fierce protection even in her dying moments. She was a mother, wounded and starving, facing down a human in her last stand. Silas, a man whose existence had been shaped by the brutal, unforgiving laws of nature, initially saw only a stark, pragmatic choice. The logical path, the one dictated by decades of survival in this harsh wilderness, was clear. Leave them. The wolf was gravely injured, the pups too weak to survive without their mother, and even if they somehow did, they would become an impossible burden, a drain on his dwindling resources. To interfere was to invite complications, to risk his own precarious existence for creatures of the wild. He had always understood that the mountains demanded a certain detachment, a cold calculation to endure. Yet, as he watched the pups shiver, their small bodies barely registering a pulse, a strange, unexpected sensation stirred within him. It was a flicker, a long-buried tenderness, a faint echo of the small hands that had once clung to his own, a daughter's laugh that had long faded from memory. The sight of their utter vulnerability, a helplessness that mirrored his own deep-seated, unspoken sorrow, pricked at something beneath his hardened logic. It was a powerful, unbidden wave of compassion rising from the deepest, most untouched parts of his soul, compelling him to act, to defy the wilderness's cruel decree. This was not about survival. It was about something far older, something more profound than mere logic. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him even more than the blizzard, that to walk away would be to lose a piece of himself he hadn't even realized was still there. For centuries, humans have found themselves drawn to acts of unexpected kindness, even in the face of immense personal risk, as evidenced by countless tales of individuals defying common sense to aid the vulnerable, often finding a renewed purpose in the act. Much like the legendary mountaineer who, in the year 1799, rescued a lost lamb from a crevasse, forever altering his perception of the wild. The decision, once made, settled in Silas's bones with a heavy, unshakable weight. It wasn't born of a sudden surge of adrenaline, but a quiet, profound conviction. He knelt, slowly, deliberately, his old knees protesting against the icy shale. Lyra's amber eyes, though still wary, tracked his every movement, a low, almost imperceptible rumble vibrating in her chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but a deep, guttural sound of warning, of fear, of utter exhaustion. The pups, tiny and fragile, continued their desperate shivering, their small bodies barely registering a rise and fall of breath. Silas knew he couldn't simply pick up the mother wolf. She was too heavy, too dangerous in her pain, and her broken leg would only worsen with clumsy handling. He needed a plan, and fast, before the blizzard truly engulfed them. He scanned the grotto, his mind racing, sifting through decades of wilderness improvisation. His gaze fell upon the remnants of the rockfall, several flat, sturdy slabs of shale. He began to clear the smaller debris with his gloved hands. Then, with a grunt of effort, he levered a larger, flatter stone, about the size of a small sled. It was rough, uneven, but perhaps just enough. Next, his eyes went to his pack. Inside, he carried his trapping tools, a small coil of rope, a thick wool blanket, and a flask of potent, homemade schnapps, usually for warmth, today for something else entirely. He carefully unwound the rope, creating a makeshift harness. Approaching Lyra was the most perilous part. He moved slowly, speaking in a low, soothing murmur, words he hadn't used in years, words meant for a child, for a scared animal. "Easy, girl. Easy now. I'm not here to hurt you." Lyra's head lifted slightly, her lips pulled back in a silent snarl, revealing teeth that could easily crush bone. But she didn't strike. Her exhaustion was too profound, her hope too dim. Silas, taking a deep breath, extended his hand, palm open, offering a small piece of dried venison from his pocket. Lyra watched it, then him, her nostrils flaring. After what felt like an eternity, her head dipped, and she snatched the meat, devouring it in a single gulp. It was a minuscule offering, but a crucial step. While she was distracted, he swiftly moved, carefully sliding the wool blanket beneath her. She flinched, a spasm of pain rippling through her, but his touch was gentle, firm. He then maneuvered the shale slab beneath the blanket, creating a crude, rigid stretcher. The pups were easier, though no less delicate. He scooped Finn first, a tiny limp weight in his massive hand. The pup let out a weak whimper, then nestled into the warmth of Silas's palm. Anya followed, a mirror image of fragility. He wrapped them both in a smaller piece of his inner lining, tucking them securely inside his coat, close to his own body heat. Their tiny heartbeats, faint but present, pulsed against his ribs, a strange, forgotten rhythm. Moving Lyra was a monumental task. He threaded the rope through the blanket and around the shale, creating handles, then began to pull. The grotto was narrow, the ground uneven. Each inch was a struggle, his muscles screaming in protest. Lyra whimpered, a low, pained sound, but she didn't fight. She seemed to understand, in some primal way, that this was her only chance. Sweat, cold and clammy, beaded on Silas's brow despite the freezing temperatures. He pulled, he pushed, he grunted, until finally, after what felt like an hour, he dragged the makeshift stretcher out of the grotto and into the swirling maw of the blizzard. The wind immediately snatched at them, a furious, invisible hand. Snow lashed his face, blinding him. He had to orient himself, relying on instinct and the faint, almost swallowed landmarks he knew so well. The journey back to the cabin, usually a familiar, if arduous trek, became a nightmare of whiteout conditions and treacherous footing. The snow was deepening rapidly, already past his knees, threatening to swallow his boots whole with every step. He could barely see 5 feet in front of him. He pulled Lyra's makeshift sled, his back aching, his legs burning. Every few yards he had to stop, gasping for air, his lungs burning from the cold. He would check on the pups, gently pressing his hand against his chest to feel their fragile warmth. He spoke to Lyra, his voice rough with exertion. "Almost there, girl. Just a little further." She would lift her head, her eyes meeting his, a shared understanding passing between man and wolf in the heart of the storm. There was no longer defiance in her gaze, only a profound, raw vulnerability. Hours blurred into an eternity of white. His body screamed for rest, for warmth, for the sanctuary of his cabin. But the tiny heartbeats against his chest, the heavy, trusting weight of the wolf behind him pushed him onward. He stumbled, fell, picked himself up, his hands raw, his face numb. The thought of giving up flickered, a seductive whisper in the back of his mind, but it was quickly extinguished by the image of the pups, by Lyra's silent plea. He was committed now, bound by an invisible thread of compassion he hadn't known he possessed. Finally, a dark shape emerged from the swirling snow, the silhouette of his cabin, a beacon in the storm. Relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He dragged Lyra to the small porch, then fumbled with the latch, his fingers stiff with cold. The cabin, usually a refuge of quiet solitude, was about to become something entirely different. Inside, the warmth of the small wood stove was a physical embrace. Silas carefully removed his coat, revealing the two shivering pups. He placed them gently on a thick sheepskin rug near the stove, their tiny bodies trembling uncontrollably. Then he turned his attention to Lyra. Getting her inside was another monumental effort. He cleared a space near the stove, moving his few pieces of furniture, creating a makeshift den. He had to drag her in, inch by painful inch, his body screaming with exhaustion. The cabin, once a bastion of human order, was transformed into a field hospital. The smell of pine and old wood was quickly replaced by the musky scent of wolf, blood, and fear. Silas worked methodically. He boiled water, sterilizing his old hunting knife over the flame. He carefully examined Lyra's leg, a clean break but complicated by a deep gash. He cleaned the wound as best he could, using his precious medical supplies, a small bottle of antiseptic, some bandages he usually reserved for himself. Lyra flinched but endured, her eyes never leaving his. He fashioned a crude splint from 2 pieces of kindling and strips of leather, carefully binding her leg. It was far from professional, but it was the best he could do. Feeding the wolves was the next challenge. He had a small store of dried venison and some hardtack. He soaked a portion of the venison in warm water, mashing it into a paste for the pups. They were too weak to eat much, but the warmth and the faint taste of food seemed to revive them slightly. For Lyra, he offered larger chunks of soaked meat. She ate slowly, cautiously, her eyes still wary, but the hunger was too great to resist. The first few days were a tense dance between man and wild. Lyra remained alert, a silent sentinel, her eyes following Silas's every move. She would growl, a low, rumbling warning if he moved too quickly or too close to her pups. Silas respected her boundaries, moving with a deliberate slowness, speaking in a soft, reassuring tone. He spent hours simply sitting, observing, allowing her to become accustomed to his presence. He cleaned her wounds daily, changed her bandages, and offered food and water. He slept fitfully, constantly listening for any change in her breathing, any sign of distress from the pups. The pups, Finn and Anya, were a different story. Their initial fear slowly gave way to the natural curiosity of the young. As their strength returned, they began to explore their small world, their wobbly steps taking them closer and closer to Silas. They would sniff at his boots, tug at his trouser legs with their tiny teeth, and eventually, one morning, Finn, emboldened, crawled onto Silas's lap as he sat by the fire. It was a small, tentative gesture, but it sent a shockwave through Silas's chest. He froze, then slowly, carefully, extended a hand and gently stroked the pup's soft fur. Anya, watching from a safe distance, soon followed her brother's lead. These small acts of trust, born from shared vulnerability and the sheer necessity of survival, began to chip away at Silas's long-held solitude. His days, once a monotonous cycle of chores and quiet endurance, were now filled with purpose, with a demanding but deeply rewarding routine. He found himself talking to the wolves, narrating his actions, sharing his thoughts, as if they were old companions. The cabin, once silent save for the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, now held the soft sounds of breathing, the the occasional hopeful whimper of a pup, the rustle of Lyra shifting on her makeshift bed. Silas began to see the world through new eyes. He noticed the subtle changes in Lyra's amber gaze, the way her tail would give a tiny, almost imperceptible wag when he brought her food. He learned the unique personalities of Finn and Anya. Finn, the brave explorer, always pushing boundaries. Anya, the gentle observer, more content to watch from a distance. He found himself laughing, a rusty, unused sound, as he watched the pups tumble and play, their youthful energy infectious. This new life, however precarious, was slowly filling the vast emptiness that had defined his existence. The lingering shadow of past regrets, though not entirely gone, began to recede, softened by the warmth of this unexpected, wild family. He was no longer just a trapper, a solitary old man. He was a caretaker, a protector, a silent witness to a miracle unfolding in his own home. The transformation wasn't just external, it was deeply internal. Silas found himself thinking less about the past and more about the present, about the next meal, the next bandage change, the next small victory in the wolves' recovery. The cold, pragmatic logic that had governed his life was being slowly, irrevocably replaced by an instinct of nurture, a profound sense of connection. He even began to hum old tunes, forgotten melodies from his youth. As he went about his chores, a stark contrast to the grim silence that had once filled his days. His dreams, once haunted by the faces of those he had lost or pushed away, now sometimes featured the soft grey fur of a wolf or the playful nip of a pup. The nearest village, St. Moritz, was a world away, a cluster of chalets and bustling life that Silas rarely visited. But even in the remote reaches of the Alps, news like the mountain wind had a way of traveling. A rare supply run to the village, undertaken by a hardy local who occasionally braved the long trek to trade furs with Silas, or a chance encounter with a fellow trapper at a distant shared spring, became the conduit. Whispers began to circulate, hushed tales of Silas and his wolves. At first, they were met with disbelief, then with a mix of fear and suspicion. Wolves in these parts were not pets. They were predators, symbols of the untamed, often seen as a threat to livestock and livelihood. Silas, already an enigma to the few who knew him, became an even greater one. His actions defied local custom, the unwritten laws of the mountains. Why would a man, especially an old trapper, bring wild wolves into his home? Was he mad? Had the solitude finally claimed his mind? Some spoke of a dangerous folly, others of a man who had finally lost his grip on reality. The rumors, though distant, carried a chilling undertone, a sense of impending judgment. Silas, however, remained oblivious, or perhaps simply chose to ignore them. His world having shrunk to the confines of his cabin and the needs of his unusual family. His focus was entirely on Lyra's slow, agonizing recovery and the growing vitality of the pups. As late winter deepened into the treacherous cusp of spring, a new, ominous threat began to emerge, one that even Silas, in his insulated world, could not ignore. Reports, carried by the same infrequent visitors, spoke of a severe epidemic among the local deer population. The mountain valleys, usually teeming with life, grew eerily quiet. Carcasses, picked clean by scavengers, were becoming a more common sight. This meant a scarcity of food for all predators, including Lyra and her growing pups. Even more disturbing were the whispers of a particularly aggressive wolf hunter, a grim figure known only as the Butcher, drawn by the spreading rumors of an unusual wolf pack in the high country. He was said to be ruthless, driven by a perverse sense of sport and a substantial bounty offered by worried farmers. This external danger, pressing in on all sides, forced Silas to confront the harsh reality of his situation. Keeping wild animals, especially a recovering wolf pack, was not sustainable indefinitely. The longer they stayed, the greater the peril, not just to them, but to himself. Lyra, though healing, was still not strong enough to hunt effectively or protect her pups in the wild. The pups, Finn and Anya, were growing rapidly, their instincts sharpening, but they were still dependent, still learning. The cabin, once a sanctuary, was becoming a cage, and a dangerous one at that. Silas knew he had to make a profound choice about their future, one that weighed heavily on his soul. He spent sleepless nights by the fire, watching Lyra's amber eyes gleam in the shadows, listening to the soft breathing of the pups. He had saved them, nurtured them, and in doing so had found a piece of himself. Now he faced the agonizing decision of how to truly set them free, how to ensure their survival in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. The wilderness had given him a purpose, a reason to live, and now it demanded a sacrifice, a difficult act of letting go, or perhaps a desperate final act of protection. The bond they had forged, so fragile yet so profound, would be tested in ways he could barely imagine. Then the mountain unleashed its fury. A ferocious blizzard, unlike any Silas had seen in years, descended upon the Alps. It was a white apocalypse, isolating him completely, burying his cabin under drifts of snow that reached the eaves. The wind shrieked like a banshee, tearing at the sturdy timbers, and the world outside became an impenetrable wall of swirling white. It was during this tempest that Lyra, already weakened by her injuries and the lingering effects of starvation, fell gravely ill. Her breathing became shallow, ragged, a desperate wheeze that tore at Silas's heart. Her body, once so powerful, trembled with fever, and her eyes, usually so bright, were clouded with pain and exhaustion. Silas, desperate, knew of rare medicinal herbs that grew high on a treacherous, exposed ridge. Herbs his grandmother had used for fevers and lung ailments. It was a perilous climb even in good weather, but in the raging storm, it was a suicide mission. Yet the thought of losing Lyra, of watching the life drain from her eyes after all they had been through, was unbearable. This was no longer just about survival, it was about a desperate, newfound attachment, a love he hadn't known he was capable of. He wrapped himself in every layer he possessed, grabbed his axe, and ventured out into the maelstrom, leaving Finn and Anya huddled together, their small bodies pressed against their ailing mother. The journey was a brutal, hallucinatory ordeal. Whiteout conditions reduced visibility to inches, and the roaring wind threatened to rip him from the mountain face. Snow fell in blinding sheets, erasing all sense of direction. He crawled on hands and knees, clawed his way up icy slopes, his aging body pushed to its absolute limits. Avalanches, unseen but felt, rumbled in the distance, a terrifying reminder of the mountain's indifference. Each step was a battle, fueled by a primal, desperate resolve, by the image of Lyra's suffering eyes. He was no longer just a man, he was a force of will, driven by an unyielding need to save. During his harrowing absence, as Silas battled the elements high on the ridge, a new terror descended upon the cabin. The blizzard, driving all creatures to desperation, had led a starving bear, a massive, shaggy beast, to his isolated dwelling. The scent of wolf, of warmth, of potential food, had drawn it like a magnet. It began to claw at the heavy wooden door, its immense paws tearing at the aged timbers, a guttural growl rumbling deep in its chest. Lyra, despite her profound weakness, despite the fever that racked her body, heard the threat. Her eyes, though glazed, snapped open. Her pups, terrified, whimpered and pressed closer to her. A primal instinct, deeper than any illness, surged through her. With a strength born of pure maternal ferocity, she dragged herself to the door, a low, fierce growl vibrating from her chest. She slammed her weakened body against the protesting wood, a desperate guttural scream echoing through the blizzard, a sound that was both a warning and a fierce, unyielding challenge to the monstrous shadow outside. The bear, surprised by the unexpected, raw defiance from within, hesitated, then, with a final frustrated roar, lumbered away into the blinding snow, leaving deep gouges in the door as a testament to its thwarted hunger. Lyra collapsed, utterly spent, but her pups were safe. Silas returned hours later, barely alive, a ghost emerging from the white hell. His face was a mask of ice, his limbs numb, but clutched in his frozen hand was a small, precious bundle of dark, aromatic herbs. He stumbled through the door, collapsing onto the floor, but his first thought was for Lyra. He crawled to her, his breath ragged, and found her weaker but alive, her eyes still holding that fierce spark. He immediately began to prepare the herbs, brewing a strong, bitter tea, which he carefully administered to Lyra. He spent the next days nursing her, his own exhaustion forgotten, his life now entirely consumed by her recovery. Slowly, agonizingly, the fever broke, and Lyra began to mend. Just as the snows began to recede, revealing the stark, beautiful landscape beneath, a figure emerged from the distant tree line. It was a young woman, her silhouette sharp against the melting snow. She moved with a confident, purposeful stride, her gaze sweeping the valley until it landed on Silas's cabin. Her name was Clara, and she was his estranged granddaughter, a wildlife researcher specializing in wolf behavior, who had been searching for him for years. She had followed the strange rumors of an old trapper and his wolves, stories that had filtered down to the nearest research station. But more than that, she had followed old family whispers, a faint trail of a grandfather who had vanished into the wilderness, a man she had only ever known through faded photographs and her mother's bittersweet memories. She was drawn by a desire to reconnect, by an innate love for the wild that, unbeknownst to Silas, ran deep in their shared blood. Clara's arrival was a shock, a sudden, unexpected intrusion into Silas's carefully constructed world. He stared at her, a stranger with familiar eyes, the eyes of his long-lost daughter. Tears, hot and unexpected, pricked at his own. Lyra, now stronger, watched from her den, a low rumble in her chest, but she did not growl. Finn and Anya, now robust and curious, peered out from behind her, their eyes wide with wonder at this new human. Clara, seeing the wolves, seeing Lyra's still healing leg, understood immediately. Her grandfather, the solitary recluse, had become a protector, a healer. She didn't question, she didn't judge, she simply observed, her scientific mind marveling at the impossible bond that had formed. She explained her work, her passion for understanding and protecting these magnificent creatures. She saw in Silas not a madman, but a man who had, through an extraordinary act of compassion, tapped into a profound connection with the natural world, a connection she herself sought. Over the next few weeks, Lyra and her pups, now strong and vibrant, began to spend more time outside the cabin, their wild instincts reawakening. Silas, with Clara's guidance, slowly prepared them for their return to the wild. One crisp morning, under the watchful gaze of Silas and Clara, Lyra led Finn and Anya to the edge of the forest. She paused, turned, and met Silas's eyes, a silent acknowledgement, a deep, unspoken gratitude passing between them. Then, with a flick of her tail, she melted into the trees, her pups following close behind. Their physical presence was gone, but their spirit, their enduring symbol, remained, woven into the very fabric of Silas's cabin and his heart. Clara, drawn by her grandfather's extraordinary story and the unique, almost mythical wolf pack he had saved, chose to stay. She set up her research equipment in a corner of the cabin, transforming it into a hub of scientific inquiry and familial warmth. Silas's life, once a lonely vigil, was utterly transformed. The unexpected reunion with his granddaughter, forged in the crucible of his compassion for the wolves, brought a warmth and purpose he had long thought lost. He taught Clara his ancient ways, the subtle signs of the forest, the wisdom of generations of mountain dwellers. He showed her how to read the tracks in the snow, how to predict the weather by the wind, how to listen to the whispers of the wild. And she, in turn, brought new perspectives, bridging their worlds with her scientific knowledge and her youthful enthusiasm. She introduced him to the latest research on wolf behavior, showing him how his intuitive understanding aligned with modern science. Their shared passion for the wilderness, for the raw, untamed beauty of the Alps, became the bridge that mended the long-broken ties of family. The cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, became a home filled with laughter, intellectual debate, and the quiet comfort of companionship. Silas found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken in decades, tales of his youth, of his daughter, of the regrets that had haunted him. Clara listened, not with judgment, but with understanding, helping him to finally confront and heal old wounds. He realized that the greatest wilderness he had ever explored was not the mountains outside, but the landscape of his own heart, and that it was the wolves, the unexpected miracle in the snow, who had guided him back to himself. Silas, no longer defined by solitude, but by connection, reflected on the profound impact of that desperate discovery in the snow. The wolves, Lyra, Finn, and Anya, became the unexpected catalysts for healing old wounds and forging new connections. His life, once a quiet endurance, now resonated with the warmth of family, the deep, enduring respect for the wild, and the understanding that compassion, even for the most untamed, can bring about the most profound and beautiful changes. He often walked the familiar trails, now with Clara by his side, searching for signs of Lyra and her growing family. Their tracks a silent reminder of the miracle he had witnessed. The mountain, once a harsh master, now felt like a benevolent guardian, and Silas the old trapper was reborn, his spirit as vibrant and alive as the wild creatures he had saved.